Welcome to Let's Talk Lucknow again. In this episode, we will look at the tradition of the Mushaira. क्या है मुशायरा? उर्दू शायरी में मुशायरे की अहमियत क्या है? इस सिलसिले की पहल कब और कैसे हुई? चलिए ज़रा पन्ने पलटते हैं इस किताब के, जहाँ माना गया है कि मुशायरा अरबी अल्फाज शरा से आगाज़ हो सकता है. From the Arabic word musara and shara, meaning participating in poetry, but also implying to feel, to know, to learn, and to compose verses. And to know not in just an ordinary way, but to know in such a way as to be enchanted and also to enchant and to be able to cast a spell with words, with a verse. No wonder the entire city of Lucknow had drowned itself in a craze for the Mushaira. Citizens had lived from one Mushaira to another, dreaming, discussing, reciting lyrics all the time. The Mushaira had provided complete entertainment, both intellectual and emotional. And the gathering of poetry lovers was also an invite to the anonymous for spontaneous recitations. The Mushaira was held at the house of a poet or a friend, at a palace of a patron, a nobleman, or at a local haveli, a luxurious, spacious mansion, that of an aristocrat. Mushaira remains a cherished tradition where poetic recitations and discussions are held even today. Way back in the 18th century, Mir Taqi Mir remembers the gathering of fellow poets in Delhi who had met regularly at the home of his uncle Siraj Khan Arzu on the 15th day religiously of every month. In the same way, Mir too began to host meetings of poets at his own residence in Delhi on the recommendation of the great Urdu poet Khwaja Mir Dard. Mir was a great admirer of Dard and he was happy to follow his advice. After having attended the first Mushaira held at Mir's place, Dard had stopped to write poetry. He renounced the world and preoccupied himself with mysticism. Several residents of Delhi began to host a gathering of poets in the same way. Writes Mir, 4 or 5 years ago, there used to be a gathering of Rekhta companions at the house of Jaffer Ali Khan. God knows what happened that caused it to break up. In the old days, for several months, the poet Kafir had fixed a gathering for Rekhta at his house. Finally, his rakish habits caused it to break up. I used to see the poet Ajiz in Hafiz Halim's Mushaira, says Mir in a document. The migration of poets and scholars from Delhi from the early 19th century had brought the tradition of the Mushaira to Lucknow. The Mushaira had featured Urdu poetry, although conversations in Persian language had continued, because Persian was still considered in the 19th century a proof of being educated. In Lucknow, the Mushaira enjoyed mass popularity. It was a favored form of cultural recreation throughout the city, and every neighborhood held its own Mushaira, infusing a love of Urdu poetry amongst the rich and the poor alike in the city. Every mushaira ended with the same cry to the sun: Please, 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 sun, do not rise till eternity. The yearning was that the night may never end and the gathering of poets without count may never disperse. The poets at the Mushaira were always as many as stars in the sky. The enthusiasm of the listeners was always overflowing, and candle after candle would melt away, but never, never the flame of passion for poetry. The host tried to understand the way hearts of the audience beat. There was fear that people may get impatient, become restless, and slip out of the hand. Then what? Therefore, the presence of a seasoned Nazim who knew when to say enough was important. Pointing to the color of the dawn, resisting a long speech, and requesting all, whether intoxicated with speech or with sleep, to rise. Arise, the Nazim would say. It is over, and the sun has come down upon the head. The planning for each mushaira was meticulous. It was important to choose the correct Nazim, the person who would preside over the mushaira. The Nazim had to be witty and sensitive to the feelings of the poets, the host, as well as the audience. In Lucknow, every evening was an invitation to a new mushaira in a different part of the city. Streets leading to the venue of the mushaira were decked up like a bride. The venue was lined with hundreds of lanterns, and lamps were lit below colorful tents inside a shamiana. The floors were covered in carpets, cushions, pillows, in wait for the many ustad to take their place on the floor with the shagirs sitting around them. In wait for the poet of the moment was a gigantic candle, that essential shama, standing below a lampshade called a fanus. According to tradition, the host received every guest and seated him accordingly. And both the poets and the guests were always dressed in their Sunday best. It was also the tradition to greet each other by standing upright, with the right hand raised to the ear, as if about to begin a prayer. A mushaira began with the presentation of compositions by younger poets, most of them disciples to an already famous ustad. To strengthen the confidence of the young poets, everyone cried, Bravo, bravo, even when the recitation was mediocre. When known poets took to the floor, it was always in the midst of great enthusiasm, expressed in abundance by the audience. Finally, when the candle and the lamps were about to die out, the most loved ustad would appear to end the mushaira with his recitations. The king at the mushaira was always the one who had received the most praise and requests to repeat his verses. Many would copy copiously recitations of their favorite poet in little booklets, in little notebooks called bayaz. An important feature of the mushaira remains its democratic character that continues to welcome all poetry lovers, irrespective of caste, creed, or gender, to this day. At the start of the mushaira, the Nazim would call for the candle stand to be placed before a poet who would either recite or inaugurate the evening in tarannum, a style of singing. The recitation was repeatedly interrupted with different words of praise by the audience. The air had echoed with loud sounds of Subhanallah, Muqarrar, Irshad from different venues where a Mushaira was hosted around the city. The Mushaira had enjoyed mass popularity in Lucknow as a favorite form of cultural recreation amongst all strata of educated urban dwellers. A mushaira was held everywhere and catered to different poetic tastes and requirements of poetry lovers. To this day, the mushaira is single handedly responsible for nourishing and for keeping the Urdu language alive. It is at a mushaira where the taste of poetry lovers of the future is allowed to flower. More about the star shire of 19th century Lucknow in the next episode. Tab tak ke liye, Khuda Hafiz.